Okay, as I said a number of times before, the theme for this month is going to be musicals that won the Oscar for Best Picture. As you can see, not all of them are going to not only not be Best Picture winners, but not even be musicals. So we're going to go based on that. Like, each one will have at least one. I think next week's is going to be the only one where it's actually two of the winners. Everything else is going to be up against something that either didn't win or may not even be in the same genre, but still I feel like line up pretty well. Obviously, this week we're going to focus on Natalie Wood falling in with juvenile delinquents as resulting in tragedy, basically. So this West Side Story is actually what we're going to start with, obviously, but West Side Story is a movie that has been with me for a while because the first time I saw it was actually in music class in 6th grade. And I really didn't know, I knew its name, but that was about it. And it was something that kind of went down the line with the classes, like the kindergartners would watch Stomp, and they'd kind of get the musicals would get more and more mature the older the kids were, and of course this was back when elementary school ended at 6th grade, and West Side Story was that point. And the interesting thing about this was it was nice to kind of see how, to get a glimpse early on how accessible this movie is when you see this class of 6th graders. And of course this is kind of the age where it's like, you kind of try to show that, well, if you're a certain type, you try not to show that you like a movie like West Side Story because it might not be cool enough or whatever, or however 6th graders think. But to my understanding, mostly the whole class seemed to be totally into it, to the point that after it got to the, obviously it was split up because it was only like a half-hour period at a time, but the bell rang like right after the rumble, after Riff and Bernardo kill each other, and I remember some of the girls actually still crying when we got back to regular classes. And just to see how it has that effect on even a young audience like that, let alone people who are actually fans of the genre, and the Academy, obviously, with its 10 Oscar wins and 11 nominations. So I think the only thing that was kind of awkward was the I Feel Pretty number, but that's only because Anger Management had just come out like that summer. So that was unfortunate timing, but regardless of that, it seemed to play really well, and still to this day, at least for me, still absolutely, because I had the great pleasure. The thing that actually set this off was the fact that I got to see a nice big screen theatrical screening of it last weekend. So I don't even think for like a particular anniversary or anything, but it was like a just because thing, I guess, which I am not going to argue with. So when you start off, one of the things I really got out of the big screen experience I noticed was the overture. Because obviously the overture is about 5 or 5.5 minutes, and at home that's an eternity. Like, no offense to the music at all. That's not to undermine that whatsoever. But it does feel like on a theater screen with that kind of sound much grander, especially when it zooms out and we finally get the title at the end of it. It's just a really huge moment. This really big introduction, and that kind of takes us into this bit of a kind of awkward introduction where we get those really big overhead shots of the city before we go into it. I guess to kind of set the scene, but I think I guess the way makes it feel kind of awkward is how sort of self-contained the set seemed to be throughout the entire movie, and this is the only glimpse we get outside of what appears to be these, sound stages or whatever. It just, I don't know that it's totally necessary, but if they want to use it to set the scene, I get it. So there's that. And they really kind of set up this world of not only that way, but this depiction of like how there's hardly any adults. Like there's the two cops, there's the lieutenant and Officer Krupke, but then there's Doc, and then there's like John Astin at the dance, and that's about it as far as ones that are prominently there. We do have like Maria's parents, for instance, but they're like Peanuts characters. They're just, we hardly hear their voices, we never see their faces, they're always like way off screen, which I've always found kind of interesting and really kind of sort of surrounds you with this sort of juvenile delinquent lifestyle to where you just feel like you feel so in it because that's all you really see. and it's not until they bring it about themselves that we see the consequences of this lifestyle. So I really like the way they do that. And then, of course, this introduction when we're introduced to the two different gangs, but starting with the Jets, and we get to see how a lot of this is told, like, through movement and dance and music and all that, and how it really shows off the rivalry between the two of them without dialogue. Not just, like, dialogue, but not even lyrics. Just the music and the way they're just kind of going about doing their thing, and then they run into Bernardo, and then just that whole thing. Like, I don't think there's any... Like, the rivalry is so incredibly established by the time we get to the point to where I think Riff is finally the one that breaks the... Like, they talk, but it's, like, really indistinct throughout this opening. I think the first words we technically hear are when Bernardo has the ball and Riff says, "Come on." But up to that point, like, they've just established everything perfectly without any use of words up to that point, and I always really love that, and it's such a great introduction. But of course, that's just our starting point, but we know eventually what's going to eke its head into this story is the romance between Tony and Maria. And obviously it being the Romeo and Juliet thing. I am very embarrassed to say that I saw West Side Story in 6th grade in school. It was not till 9th grade in school we were studying Romeo and Juliet, and it was brought up as one of the many one of the many things that Romeo and Juliet influenced. And it honestly wasn't until then that had occurred to me. And it's so blatantly obvious, as I said, that is humiliating to admit. But yeah, so obviously one of the reasons a lot of people, like, criticize the movie and think it doesn't fully work is the fact that Natalie Wood and Richard Beymer not only seem miscast, but they don't really have a whole lot of charisma, I guess. Wood is... I think one of the reasons, it's not necessarily just that she's playing a Puerto Rican that Natalie Wood feels miscast, but there's also, for me anyway, there's something a bit quite innocent about Maria, and Natalie Wood was always at her best playing, like, more mischievous characters, at least to me. But also that, and it's also the whole dubbing thing, which honestly is another thing that I probably never would have noticed if it hadn't been brought to my attention. I guess it's just something I didn't really pay attention to, because the syncing is, like, perfect, really, with all the dubbing that went on. And it's like, and you'd also kind of get that there's kind of a strength lacking in this performance, especially since, despite the movie getting 11 Oscar nominations, Natalie Wood was nominated for Best Actress, but the Academy chose Splendor in the Grass for her nomination instead of this. I think that speaks volumes, but... yeah, but she's obviously also a major player in that, whereas even though she's, like, the above the title credit here, it almost feels like it's... Their romance, despite being the heart of the story, only feels like a fraction of it, because the rest of it is just so big and so much more attention-grabbing. And that's not to say, like... And I guess, yeah, another problem people can probably have is how fast the romance is, but... You know, once again, just point back to Romeo and Juliet, and it's like, that's kind of what the story is that they fall in love too fast. And that's where the consequences start to come into play. And it's something I never really picked up on for a while until I was watching it again, and then it's like, when you talk about how fast the romance happens, I tend to not realize that, the point, like, the entire first almost hour and a half of the movie, up to the intermission, the opening scene... on, like, the basketball court, all the way to them deciding what weapons they're going to use at the Rumble, and then Tony walking away in his, oblivious, lovey glee or whatever, into the intermission, all takes place in one day. It doesn't feel like it at all. It feels like it's like a whole span, but yeah, just through little pieces of dialogue and just watching it in general, you can tell the entire first half of this movie is just that one day. We see Tony and Maria's entire romantic relationship in real time throughout the entire movie. Like, I think the only time that we miss between the two of them is when he's at her place and it, like, dissolves and then they're in bed. or it cuts to another scene and they're in bed. One of those. That's like the only part of their romance that we don't see is that one moment in the bedroom. Being 1961, I'm not quite sure what they're implying or what they were allowed to imply happened, but it all seems fairly innocent regardless. But yeah, and obviously, even though their romance may not seem like it's as on fire as it should be because of that, because of the performances, there's still something there, like the iconic imagery of them replicating the balcony scene, only in this very, you know, streets of New York, alleys of New York way, where it's them like behind the bars. It's a bit on the nose, but it's, you know, still an iconic image that everybody would recognize, and there's something romantic about it. But even then, talking about like how quickly they fall in love, there's like Rita Moreno towards the end gets a whole song to call that out. So it's like it does feel like it's really in that vein of it is half romantic, but it's well aware of just how, you know, naive this romance is. Because, like, but once again, you know, that is brought to life through the brilliance of Sondheim and Bernstein. So, because there's the music pretty much adds where they lack, and there's the whole thing of it's really it's just all in the lyrics. Like I said, regardless of, you know, the performances themselves or the fact that they may or may not be dubbed in some cases. The music makes sure all the points get there that need to be there. Like, the song Maria, Say It Loud and there's music playing, Say It Soft and it feels like praying. That's pretty romantic shit, regardless of how well the actors themselves are putting it on the screen. The music absolutely brings that out, as it should, in just this genre in general. And that brings us to the great supporting cast. Even though George Chakiris is the one that won the Oscar for supporting actor, my favorite of the supporting players has always been Russ Tamblyn as Riff. There is, obviously, not only is he like the most likable character, but when you really look at it, despite all the stuff that's going on, I feel like Riff is the one throughout the entire story that has the most to do, also. Like, so many of the songs center around him performing them, and he's got such a command. Like, I'm pretty sure I was hearing that Russ Tamblyn is one of the few who like has to do like, you know, the really big musical numbers in the movie that had like an extensive background already before this movie in both categories, in both the you know, dancing and singing, but also acting. Like he was already 4 years off his Oscar nomination for Peyton Place by this point. And the interesting thing about it is that he actually, when he went into this movie, he was auditioning for Tony. But it's like, I think getting Riff might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. Because like I said, he gets to play, you know, the most likable character. He gets all the stuff to do. He gets like, if he had played Tony, there is no way he would have gotten to show off just what he can do with all the, like, just this incomparable talent and energy that he has, particularly with the, when I was talking about the total command of these musical sequences, it's because he's got this, well, he's got, like, the gymnastics and the, you know, acrobatics sort of background, that I guess, he apparently told an anecdote once where he was saying that when they were doing that, and knowing that he had that background, Jerome Robbins, when he was, you know, choreographing everything, said, I don't think Riff should do that. Like, I get that that's your background, but let's just kind of stick to the dancing thing. But then, of course, Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins had their issues, and Wise thought he was taking up way too much time on a lot of stuff, so he was basically fired, despite the fact that he was still around long enough and made as much of an impact that, not only is his stamp definitely here, but he also won Best Director with Robert Wise, which is a double Best Director win. Wouldn't happen again until the Coen brothers with No Country for Old Men. It's a really rare thing. But after that happened, and they decided, you know, the next person that came in basically said, you know what, do what you want, do the gymnastics, do the tumbles, do all that stuff that you know, and Riff will be that character. And then I guess he went to, like, a showing, like a stage version that Jerome Robbins had put on, and after the movie, and Riff was, like, doing gymnastics and tumbling because he saw what Tamblyn did in the movie and how great it was, and he decided to go ahead and say, yeah, just let's make that Riff's character, because he's got those great memorable moments that are just these fleeting moments in these really big numbers. Like the one I always hear about is when he comes down from the bar towards the beginning. But the one that always stood out to me was during the Officer Krupke number when he's doing they're doing the psychiatrist bit where he's laying on his back, and then he flips up and does that handstand against the wall, and then somehow, like, slithers down onto his stomach. Like, that's the one that always just kind of blew my mind when I see it. So that's really great stuff, and that's always the character that kind of always stuck with me in his performance. So, but then, you know, that's not to take away with what Chakiris did and his... I think it's very interesting that he won an Oscar for this when you look back at the performance, because it's more so about... He doesn't have particularly big scenes. Even when he's in, like, musical numbers, he's not really that, you know, big towards it. And to think that an actor won an Oscar for a movie like this, you think more of a performance like Riff. You don't think of a performance like Bernardo. So I've always found it they're very interesting, but there's something about just kind of the commanding presence that he has. Like, that very first second we see him when he's got the basketball in his hands, and it's like, we're not even... Like, if you go into this blind, you don't even realize right away that he's the rival gang leader. You just think maybe he's just a dude, but there's just an instant, like, confrontational thing here. Like, we know it is absolute trouble that they run into him just at the first sight of him. And then he kind of maintains that throughout the movie, because it's like, when he's... Even though he doesn't really... At least the way my memory sees it, he doesn't really say a whole lot. And like I said, he's never necessarily, like, the center of a big musical number or anything. But his presence is always very apparent when he is there. And that really does go a long way. So, especially in a movie like this, where there's so much that's so big about it. And of course, he plays perfectly, you know, the kind of guy... The arrogance. Just the absolute arrogance. The arrogance to the point that Bernardo is the kind of guy that we learn schedules a rumble. A moment where the gangs are going to get together and beat the holy fuck out of each other, maybe potentially kill each other, and he is so arrogant that he schedules a date with Rita Moreno for after the Rumble. Like, he's under the impression he will be that okay. And I've always kind of loved that about his character, even though he deeply, deeply regrets it. And then, of course, you know, Rita Moreno also won Best Supporting Actress, and she does get, like, she gets the really big scenes. She gets more big scenes than Natalie Wood does. And she gets, you know, a couple of numbers that she is the center of, and she just really, really commands that in a big way. And so, talking about the Rumble itself, this is the interesting thing that West Side Story does that feels sort of uncommon in musicals like this, especially for, like, the era that these musicals came out, especially by MGM, when you have these musicals were like these really big, fantastical worlds where, like, everything is glorified, everything's exaggerated, everything is colorful and dancing around, all that stuff. And West Side Story gives you this big, massive dose of reality during this Rumble, where it feels like it's still theatrical, obviously, but it really feels like it just hits a darkness so suddenly in a way that musicals like this don't typically portray. Because we've got stuff like, and it's not just, you know, what happened, but it's the aftermath also, like, the scene where we kind of build up. We know that something is already really bad, but there's the point in time, briefly, where we, the audience, knows, but Maria doesn't. And so she's, like, really content, she's really in love, and she's on the roof, and she's just dancing peacefully, and it's like, this is like the last moment her life is going to be peaceful before she finds out what happened at the Rumble. And so there's moments like that, and then there's stuff that you just really don't expect that's so dark, like Baby John's reaction. When, like I said, up to this point, we have seen, you know, just everybody dancing around, even the fights. You know, some people might think they look silly or whatever, but yeah, there is the whole, even when they're fighting, they're, like, dancing. And it's this really big theatrical thing. And then you just get this moment, after both Riff and Bernardo have been stabbed and killed, and Baby John has this reaction where he's just breaking down, and he tells Arab, "Did you see their faces? Like, he doesn't say this outright, but he's saying, did you see their faces as they knew they were dying?" And it's like, that just got really dark in a big way, and the movie kind of manages to stay on that. There's still, like, you know, a big number kind of in there, but it maintains that darkness that starts immediately when Riff gets stabbed and all the way to the end, where it's just going to be nothing but tragedy up to this point. And they even have like a big kind of lead into it. Like there is like the imaginary wedding, which is the very last scene before the Rumble. And it's like this, you know, it's one of those cases where you see it a totally different way the first time you see it and then every other time you see it. Because it's like, this, they're talking about, you know, who's going to be there. He's saying, like, Riff's going to be his best man and all that. And what is, like, really playful and romantic once, it just is this really, really tragic thing now for this thing that we know will never happen. And that these people that they're saying will be there won't even be alive to be there, let alone for this ceremony to take place. And there's even like the big foreboding thing of like that even one of the lyrics is, you know, even like death won't part us now, and it's like obviously there's the wedding vow, but it's also just they don't even realize how much death is going to part them. They have no idea up to this point. And speaking of having no idea of what it is you're singing about, there's this whole thing where the dooming moment when they're doing the Tonight number as they're all coming towards the Rumble, and like the sun is setting and everything has this really dooming orange tint to it. And it's like everybody's like, while they're ready to fight, they're not quite sure exactly where it's going to go. We also have, like, the happy singing. Like, Rita Moreno's, like, so pumped that she's going to have a date with Bernardo. Maria's so, you know, still obliviously in love and all that. But then, when they're singing and they're talking about the Rumble, it's like they don't even realize what they're getting into, even though it's right in front of their faces and it's coming out of their mouths. Like, when they say, we're going to cut them down to size tonight. It's like, cut them down is very, very on the nose, with more so than they even realize. And then there's like the lyric, we're going to watch Bernardo drop tonight. It's like they had no idea to the extent that that actually would happen, and they're just charging right to it without even knowing it. And that's really that whole thing, to where it's like just everything in this movie, all the tragedy is brought about by the naivete of these people, which, like I said, goes way back to Romeo and Juliet, but the way this movie portrays it through these songs specifically, and it's still kind of, it feels like its own story, too, with its own characters coming from different directions. Yeah, I mean, of course we've got, you know, Riff's Mercutio and Bernardo's Tybalt, but they still feel like they're in their own given story, which I think is really powerful in regards to a movie that is, or a story that's so, you know, has been expanded as much as Romeo and Juliet has. And West Side Story just kind of always does feel like its own thing, even though it's clearly the exact same layout almost. And then we finally get to this moment when the adults finally kind of come into it, particularly this scene when Doc just kind of breaks down and talks about, like, the senselessness of everything, and it's really just kind of the punctuation the movie needs to make its point, with Doc being the character that's been walked all over this whole time, being the one that says, the one that basically has to break down and say why, you know, but, and that's like the first perspective we really get from an adult that doesn't feel like curmudgeonly throughout it. And it's this really real moment. Unfortunately, it only even gets worse, and it's like kind of showing the futility of even saying, you know, why do you guys have to do this, and what exactly do you have to prove? The youth is going to be the youth, and a lot of times that can be, yeah, ill-advised. And so, yes, but apart from that, obviously the movie is known for its relentless energy and the really, you know, big color palette and all that, and it's really just in a way that a lot of musicals like can maintain, but to me there's always been something just particularly special about this one, to how much it maintains that energy even in its darkest moments. And I think that kind of has something to do with it, to where like the musicals in this era rarely, you know, went in directions like that, but still managed to maintain their energy throughout it. Even when there's not even musical numbers, just what Wise was able to accomplish here, it just the whole thing feels so big and epic, despite the fact that it's like 2 days, and And yeah, it's really, really remarkable. And like I said, every song is memorable. Every song is a classic and iconic. There are songs that you recognize immediately. Even the ones like I'm not particularly big on the America number, but I mean it's like one of the most famous numbers in the movie still. So that's just kind of amazing. But yeah, and of course, it did go on to win 10 Oscars. Let me see if I've got this off the top of my head. It was picture, director, supporting actor, supporting actress, cinematography, editing, production design, costumes, score, and sound. Thank God. But the thing about that also is it makes you wonder about the competition, how much it would have won, because this was an era where like stuff like production design, cinematography, costumes, and all that were split up as categories between black and white and color. So it was really kind of able to push off the competition. Like its black and white competition was like Judgment at Nuremberg, The Hustler, and La Dolce Vita. But I still think it probably could have been, like in another year, Judgment at Nuremberg would have been the big juggernaut, without a doubt. It still won Best Actor in Adapted Screenplay, which is the only one that this lost. It lost to Judgment at Nuremberg. And I still think it would have done pretty well. But, like, the only one I can imagine it losing if the categories weren't split up was the black and white winner for costumes was La Dolce Vita. I think that probably always would have happened. La Dolce Vita always would have won costumes, regardless of if they were split up. But still, if that were to happen and it still won everything else, that would be 9. So even then, I feel like it was too big to fail. So, yes. So that's really all I have to say about that. We go on to look at a similarly reckless youth in Rebel Without a Cause, this time through Nicholas Ray's eyes, who we'll talk about further. But to get into our setup here, when we first are introduced to our 3 main characters in the police station, it's kind of like, obviously our opening title sequence here is just a very, drunk Jim Stark laying on the ground, getting ready to be swept up by the cops and taken in, likely again. But in this opening scene, despite the fact that Jim Stark is absolutely our focus, it seems like it almost goes to set up like an ensemble. Like it's not just kind of we're introduced to Jim, but we're kind of introduced to all 3 of them at the same time. And for a while there, it kind of feels like maybe we're not just going to focus on mainly one. Like, we almost, like, as soon as he's in the police station, we're immediately meet the Natalie Wood character, who is saying stuff like, I'll never get close to anybody and stuff like that, which is obviously a blatant sign that this movie will end with her making a connection with somebody. Very well could be the people who are conveniently in the room with her right now. And we see some more and more similarities between them as it goes on, particularly between Dean and Wood's characters, before we even go into Plato. But there's also, especially with their parents, especially their dads, really. I mean, there's obviously the idea that Stark's mother is the one that kind of walks all over the family and kind of has this, unbeatable control or whatever, especially over his dad. But it's really, the conflict comes from the fact that he just can't stand to see his dad just walked all over like that. And that eventually becomes a rift between them. But then there's also the very different one with Wood and her dad, where it's like this... He's they allude to the fact that he may be attracted to her in a way to where when she kisses him, even innocently, he gets really weird about it and really flips out. And that's, there's clearly something here, and obviously both of them are kind of taking time bombs into going into just, full-on rebellious territory because of this. Especially when we get this first scene with Jim, when it's clear that he's this kind of ticking time bomb character whenever his parents are around. Not necessarily all the time, but when his parents are around, because he's obviously a bit drunk and he's just kind of, seems to just kind of be taking life in. He's trying to, talk up to Plato and all that. He says later that he's not into making friends. That's not his point. But he really seems to push this kind of friendship on Plato, and then eventually her coming into it also. But then once his parents enter the picture, it just takes very little to get him to switch and blow up. and his famous "You're tearing me apart" line in the scene seems to just come from out of nowhere because he's so kind of, even though he's drunk, he's still relatively collected and seems happy with himself, more or less. But then his parents start arguing, and it's like, it's hard to tell, like, how, if he's ever blown up at them before, or if this is, like, the first time and it's, this argument finally just broke the camel's back. Well, you could just chalk it up to his drunkenness. Either way, it's clear that there is a rift here between him and his family, so, and obviously with Wood's family as well, especially when she freaks out about who has been called to pick her up. And it would not have been her choice. But going on this, though, there's also the introduction of Plato, who's kind of coming from a different direction, a complete absence of parents, which is very interesting, kind of the opposite of where they're coming from. But there's still something here, particularly with his nanny that now takes care of him, and there's that particular scene that I kind of really like, where it's very quickly we learn Plato's rebelliousness in a very kind of subtle way, where he's being asked questions and he's not answering them. And the way it is that he's asked a question, his nanny answers for him. He's asked another question, his nanny answers for him. So finally, after enough of this, the cop turns to the nanny and asks her a specific question, and it's only then that Plato responds. He doesn't necessarily answer the question, but it's the first time he seems to respond, is when he's not being asked the question. It just kind of seems like this small little rebellious nature coming out of Plato that's going to kind of gradually grow as the movie goes on, regardless of in more kind of dark ways than the others. Because we obviously learn right away that the reason he's here is for shooting puppies. So it's like, it's up to Salminio to basically make this character very sympathetic, which he actually does effectively, despite the fact that this is how we're introduced to him. That he is... that he has been arrested, or at least put in this police station because he was shooting and killing puppies. But somehow all three of these characters will find connection, and that's the point that we come to. And it all is brought about by our central character, who is Jim, brought to life by James Dean. And the interesting thing about this is that the Jim Stewart character kind of seems to be, like, almost like misinterpreted in pop culture as like this kind of troublemaker figure. But that's really not what he is. Because it's like, and yeah, there are kind of, it seems like they're kind of borrowing a bit from like the Brando character in The Wild One, for instance, the one that's asked, what are you rebelling against? And he just says, what do you got? But there is something to this character. Like, he's, like, there's the scene when he steps on the Insignio, his first day of school, and he seems like genuinely sorry about doing that very minuscule thing when he's confronted about it. And then when it comes to the knife fight with Buzz and all that, and even the choking run with Buzz, it's like, he's not confrontational, and he doesn't want to fight. He only does when he's absolutely positively driven to that, to where he might think that that's his last resort. And it's all more about where he's coming from in regards to, like, something that's really brought to life in the scene with the planetarium, when it's like the youth is kind of already at this point to where it's like, you know, what is our purpose, what does life mean, and all that. And then they get this very poorly timed trip to the planetarium where they learn that the sun will eventually explode and wipe out, you know, the entire Earth and all that stuff. And it's like, oh, it doesn't matter, the Earth won't be missed, the guy says. And it's like, it just really hammers home. This is not a subtle movie. Like, if you want to, I can understand being critical of this movie, and that it can seem a bit dated and all that, and seem very, very, you know, melodramatic. You kind of just got to know that's the movie that you're in for. And it actually does that quite well. Because there is also, like, talking about Dean's portrayal of this is where this comes from. Because I talk about the melodramatic, I talk about it not being subtle. But the interesting thing about this is that when this was coming out with Brando kind of doing... It had been around. Like, you could look at, like, Jimmy Stewart or something. Probably, you know, go back to some older French movies. But this idea of wherever the transition happened to when acting became big and theatrical to trying to be natural and realistic. And Dean's performance in this kind of seems to find a middle ground for whatever the moment requires, or in some cases it almost feels like a bit of both, especially when you're portraying the youth, because the youth obviously can be very dramatic. They think everything in life is the end of the world, or the biggest thing that's going to ever happen to them, or the only thing that's ever going to happen to them. So Dean actually, and obviously with the direction of Ray, manages to kind of find that middle ground to where it feels like it's sort of half theatrical and half realistic, which is basically the embodiment of the way the youth sees the world, more or less. Or most of the youth, anyway. Like, the typical youth. And it's able to kind of do this thing to where, it's my understanding, it was kind of the starting point, this performance, where there was, like, for a while there was, like, certain types of the way men were depicted in movies and the characters that they absolutely had to be. And this was sort of a case to where they could be, like, sort of more well-rounded, I guess, because a lot of them were, like, you know, they either had to be, like, really, really tough or, like, really, really determined. Just kind of these, you know, generic movie roles to whatever story they happen to be in. But mainly talking about drama here. But the thing is that they could really sort of shake it up a little bit and add, like, an ambiguity to it. And kind of go in different directions that might be unexpected for roles like this. And a lot of that also is in Dean's physicality, which is kind of just, you know, instantly recognizable. And just the way he was really able to bring that to life, and especially when you go into just the conflicts that are within him, like particularly obviously the big, you know, starting point of like the jumping off point for the drama for most of the movie is his pride being tested by Buzz, and this whole thing where it's like, that's one of those cases where it's like, in another movie it might be seen as like, you know, oh well, he's, you know, a guy and he has to be, you know, the guy's guy around everybody else, or people will think he's, you know, emasculated or something. But it's more so in a very relatable way, because of that moment to where he's not just saying, you know, like, oh, you know, I gotta kick his ass, I gotta do the chickie run because I'm a man and stuff like that. It's more like, there's that whole moment with his dad where he has to question, like, should I even do this? Like, is it worth me proving my self-worth that I could die doing this, or somebody could die doing this? And you really kind of see that ground that didn't seem to be covered that much with characters like this in this time period, where he actually questioned, you know, I could always, you know, react to this in a different way. I could, you know, it's totally in the likelihood that I could just run away from this or find some other solution than to not confront it in that way. And of course, this is, you know, balanced by the fact that he's asking his dad this while his dad is wearing an apron, and being absolutely concerned of what his mother's going to come home to and stuff like that. And there's obviously, like I said, not necessarily subtle, but absolutely proves its point and has that point to make in its own way that really, you know, was huge. Like I said, for this time period, that's the really important thing to look at. 1955. And as I said, this comes from Nicholas Ray, who is a director that has come, before this was in many directions, and after this went in many directions, particularly with the two movies that jump out at me for Rebel Without a Cause are his first movie, They Live by Night, and the movie that came right after this one, which was Bigger Than Life, where in They Live by Night he was basically doing that whole approach to the youth and like basically doing this whole sensitive portrait about it. And then the movie after this, Bigger Than Life, with James Mason and Walter Matthau. All these movies I like extremely recommend, by the way. Where it was just this really big melodrama, and it was, you know, it was like, you know, going after conformism and all that. And it seems like kind of a combination of these things that this movie found. Kind of this, you know, sort of peak moment in his filmography to where what he had done up to that point and what he would do in the future kind of collided and became told this one story in such an effective way, but taking these different approaches. Because he even tackled, you know, kind of the melodrama stuff with, like, kind of in the noir category with In a Lonely Place, or in like with a western setting in Johnny Guitar. He was able to just really bring this stuff to life in all these different backgrounds. And this was kind of the whole culmination of that, whether it had been before or after. And it was also, it's my understanding that the studio actually wanted it to be in black and white, and it was his idea to say, like, you know, if I do this in color, it's going to feel, you know, more vivid and more fresh and more really, like, it's portraying the youth. Like, there's just something youthful about its appearance that doesn't that might have been lost in the black and white, to where it just really kind of comes out in this really big and fresh way. And yeah, there are certainly, you know, obviously it's going to lead to tragedy and then more tragedy the more Plato starts to lose his way. But there's also kind of that whole looming thing now where real life came into it, to where, like, all three major players in this had premature deaths in real life, with Dean's crash and Wood's drowning and Minio's murder. And obviously, you know, still in their... Two of them were still in their youth. Wood was in her 40s, but even so, that's still pretty young, especially for somebody that was just so prominent. Yeah, obviously, you know, it's this really just... Like, I throw the word iconic around with both these movies quite a bit, but I mean, what word do you use to describe Rebel Without a Cause, if not iconic? And like I said, yeah, it could be seen as dated, and certain aspects of it certainly are. But it's clear, like, a whole generation was just taken in by this to say either that's me or I want that to be me. And it's like that it may not have that impact today, or at least not nearly as strong. But at that time, it certainly was just, like, absolutely that betrayal, showing, like, you know, the youth grappling with, like, self-worth, and then there's the whole distancing between parents, where it's like that whole thing of, like, as you grow, when you're a child, you see your parents in, like, this untouchable way, and it's like, oh, they must know everything, they must know how to take care of everything, and then as you grow up and you realize that they can just be a complete mess, and, like, they're just as lost in their adulthood as you are in your, you know, teen years. And the way it captures that. And then, of course, you know, just the main thing is the finding the connection. It's like, even if you say, you know, like, I'm not in it to make friends or whatever, obviously he desperately wanted that connection with Plato. Plato desperately wants that connection with him. They talk to each other, like, twice, and he's already telling Natalie Wood, oh yeah, he's my best friend. I called him Jamie. And and of course, Wood. I don't think Wood fits into it as well because of I think her whole connection to Buzz kind of, you know, weakens the way she comes into it with the two of them. Like, the way she gets here, yeah, there's the whole setup with her dad and her family life and all that. But the Buzz thing does kind of throw that off balance a little bit, her inclusion in this. But it's still certainly there for a purpose that ultimately it does sort of come to, in that, you know, just finding a connection to somebody kind of thing in some way or whatever. So yeah, and if I had to choose between the two, I've been much more, like, I don't know if it's because I grew up with it more or what it was, but yeah, I've always been really drawn to West Side Story in a really big way. And it's like, I do understand, like, at the time, the way people could really connect to Rebel Without a Cause, and some of that certainly is still very much in there. But it does also very, very much feel like it's from 1955 at the same time, so I'm sort of half and half on how much of an impact it still has now, but yeah, certain parts of it definitely are still there. And like I said, it's kind of this sort of, you know, peak moment for a director like Ray that had such a great sort of kind of overlooked filmography for a lot of cases. So, like, everybody, it's like one of the most famous movies ever, but the rest of his movies are, like, just as worth checking out, and, like, hardly anybody seems to really know them much. So yeah, but I will side with the musical this time, but we'll see what happens. Like I said, next week they'll both be musicals that both won Best Picture. They're both from the same decade by the same director, so neither of which I don't think people particularly like, that they have the Best Picture connotation, but we'll explore them and we'll talk about it and see where we get. So and then obviously reviews coming. We have Ant-Man and The Purge and Gaudi, and we'll see what else happens. So we'll see what else this month brings with these, and until then,